don't chase trends. We on the wave. Legos to the world. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build.
Continent DNA.
My guest, Céleste Vogel, is building the operating system that makes electric mobility viable at scale. She did not start in the streets of Nairobi. She spent over 20 years in the high-stakes world of global finance and law at institutions like Swiss Re and Citibank. Today, she's the co-founder and CEO of eWAKA Mobility. She has traded the boardroom for the charging station, and she is proving that electric vehicles aren't just green. They are the smartest way to build a resilient economy. Celeste, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tobe. Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
What does eWAKA stands for?
In terms of the name or in terms of what we do?
Exactly, the name and the ideology behind it.
So eWAKA should inspire thoughts about, for those of us who are from West Africa, about moving. As you know, in Pidgin and in general parlance in West Africa, we use the word waka to mean to walk, to move. And so we thought, my partner Jimmy and I, when we started and were looking for a fitting name, we thought we wanted a name that meant something in West Africa and in East Africa. So for me, it was electric move, electric mobility. And I'm told in Swahili, waka means ignited, so electrically ignited. So there we are.
Okay, eWAKA sounds more like a Nigerian name, but I assume that is not the case. But so, based on what you said, Swahili, is that correct? That was the origin of the name eWAKA.
Swahili, but I think it also resonates for West Africans, as you say, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Ghana, when you say waka, and people think of moving.
I want to understand, what structural gap did you see that required eWAKA to operate as an ecosystem platform, rather as a manufacturer or lender?
When we started, certainly the focus was on electric mobility and how electric mobility could address some of the transportation issues on the continent. But I think the biggest gap that became evident as we dug deeper was really the fragmentation in the transportation and logistics. And that's why an ecosystem approach seeks to address these various fragmented pieces that make the whole logistics space in Africa so inefficient and so frustrating for all stakeholders.
When you talk about fragmentation in terms of e-mobility in West Africa, I think that's where your market is right now. What do you mean exactly by that? Because for different groups, fragmentation can also mean different things. Based on the research I did, I understood that you source the riders, you provide these riders as well to the end users, which is the vendors or property customers.
You talk about e-mobility, but I think it's a broader, we should look at the mobility space in a broader way. In African mobility markets, OEMs sell bikes, right? Whether it's like your Bajaj or, and vehicles generally, right? Like cars, etc. Financiers provide capital, right? Riders and drivers operate generally informally. And technicians, mechanics, etc. repair the vehicle reactively. And vendors or merchants struggle with unreliable delivery or unreliable transportation generally. So no one actually coordinates the performance across the entire value chain. So when one layer fails, for example, when a rider defaults, right, or when the asset fails, the defaults arise, the downtime increases, vendor trust erodes, people like you and me who depend on, deliveries or drivers to move around, we get frustrated. So we realized very early that coming into this space and bringing in like this whole new technology that electric mobility offers, was not going to be enough. It wasn't going to be enough to just electrify, in our case, the Buddha Buddha, or, as they say, for example, in Nigeria, or the Kada, right? Without actually restructuring the operating chain. That was really necessary. So when we built eWAKA, we saw eWAKA, and it was not so evident at the beginning, but as we dug deeper, especially in our market research and in our first deployment, we built eWAKA as an intelligence layer, one that connects all these pieces together. So you're connecting the driver, rider to the capital, you're connecting to operators. We act as an OEM and an operator. We connect them to technicians and mechanics generally, and we connect them to vendors. Very important, because you need to be connected to that source of work that allows you ultimately to not only pay for your vehicle, but also increase your take-home pay. So for us, we always say we're not. This is really more than just about bikes. We're not, sort of like buying bikes from China and then just selling them. It's not, as we say in Cameroon, it's not a buy and sell them. Game here. We are aligning incentives and performance across the chain. For us, the bike is the hardware, but the platform is really the infrastructure that brings everything together. It's like a rail that we're building.
You integrated the value chain, and just because of the way the system or the ecosystem is set up in Africa in general, in terms of sourcing the riders, how do you go about that? Because that is quite a difficult situation. You need someone who is reliable. You need someone that somehow has proven his or herself that they can deliver. Looking at the way data, it is not very easy to get that kind of verification in Africa compared to Europe. So how did you go about that in terms of sourcing the right riders that at the end of the day they will be able to deliver?
Yeah, so Tobe, this is a really good question, because on the one hand, motorcycles are the main mode of transportation on our continent for various reasons. So motorcycle drivers or riders are also the backbone of the economy, right? And a lot of people think about it as something that kind of like is there, right? Like when you want to move quickly, you just hop on the back of a motorcycle if you don't want to be stuck in traffic for hours. And the reality is that it's a very informal economy. People get a bike, and in most cases, they don't own the bike, right? Like you living in Germany might buy a bike for one of your relatives, and then they expect them to give you, a certain amount at the end of the day. And so they're basically hustling. And so we saw this very early, and we saw that it was important to kind of like bring the drivers into a fold where we could actually train them and communicate to them the tricks and the tricks of the game, to show them how to actually make money from these platforms. Uber came, Bolt came, all of these platforms, but the reality is that a lot of people find it frustrating. And when you go to some cities, you see they're striking left and right, and a lot of times it may be justified, but a lot of times there's a lot that you can do yourself, right? And so getting riders interested is not a huge problem. They come to you, especially with a vehicle like an electric vehicle that saves you fuel costs and maintenance costs, etc. Now, the key point is what you mentioned, like how do you get a reliable one? So we focus on that training aspect. We have built an onboarding platform that allows us to attract riders. Like we can attract them. People come to us through our website. They come to us through our social media platforms. We're on all of them, and a lot of times it's really word of mouth, right? Like a happy rider will bring his brother or his cousin, etc. And so that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is when you've got people. Like, how do you identify the things about these people that can predict success? Success in terms of being able to repay if you get a loan, success in being able to follow instructions, success in wanting to be successful. And this is something you find, right? We find that our riders, our system is centered around them, and we find that's all they're asking for. They're asking for a structured environment in which they can be assured that if they do certain things, they will be taking home at the end of the day or at the end of the week an amount of money that will allow them to not only take care of their families, but actually to build long-lasting prosperity. And so that's how we do it. We bring them in through platforms and through word of mouth.
That sounds very difficult, and I guess I can only imagine the amount of work that have to go into that kind of system. But looking at that, is the bottleneck in African e-mobility technological, or is it financing architecture and credit design?
There are multiple bottlenecks, right? But I don't think that the constraint is really technology per se, right? Because the bikes work. And then you can see that, like at this point in Kenya, for example, I mean, the OEMs are coming, literally by the dozen. So it's not that we the industry hasn't been able to put out a vehicle that works and to some extent works even on the challenging terrain on the continent. That's not really the issue. The real constraint, in my view, is access to the vehicle, financial access. The financing architecture in informal cash flow environments can be predatory. Riders, they earn daily income, not monthly salaries, so they're required to pay daily. Whatever challenges come their way, whether they're sick, whether they are, for whatever reason, have a death in the family and cannot work or whatever it is, they're still required to pay on a daily basis, right? So you have this like financing architecture that can be predatory at times, and traditional underwriting models don't fit that reality, right? And so that's one bottleneck. I mean, another bottleneck that we have identified is the reliability associated with knowing when, in the case of delivery, for example, like when you order something, or you as a vendor, when you send your goods, on a bike or in a car or in a truck or whatever, is knowing where that good is. We have this early reliance on apps, but if you switch off the app, then you've lost eyes on your goods. And so coming back to what I said earlier in terms of technology, the bike itself works, but now the question is, can e-mobility actually offer something more than what the previous petrol bikes offered? And so we found that, for example, when you integrate telemetry in your vehicles, so IoTs, and ability to actually keep your eyes on your battery or on your vehicle and be able to manage it, that you then move to the next best thing, which is it's not just about tracking, right? It's about being able to manage the vehicle at a distance, like being able to switch it off, being able to know where it is at all times. Productivity analytics, how does your rider drive? You know that we have batteries in these vehicles, and the use of the battery is an important element in this whole game between, like, is it more productive than a fuel bike? Maintenance tracking, being able to predict when a part will break down or will need to be changed, being able to predict when you would need to order it, like how much it would cost, like through tracking that. And then I think one of the biggest advantages of the space that we have built through this intelligence layer is being able to actually track the remittance, because remittance of money on a daily basis is actually how the rider can actually hope to one day own this bike and then be able to actually earn enough money. So all of these things make capital become more confident, because now you are able to better measure your risk, and you are able to better predict your earnings on your investment.
How long did it take you to get this far? Because if I understood correctly, and based also my experience on ground in Nigeria, this kind of ecosystem you describe is not readily available. And how did you assemble the team that helped you to put this up?
We incorporated 2021
Mhm.
in Kenya. 2022 was a very slow year of learning. It was also a challenging year in Kenya. It was an election year. It was a year during which the Kenyan shilling depreciated quite a bit to the US dollar. The economy was tough. Fuel prices were volatile. So, but it actually, what seemed like really bad things happening actually turned out to be a breeding ground for actually understanding the challenges and understanding the opportunity that e-mobility could present. And so in 2022, we did a lot of testing. We deployed our first fleet. We started with cargo bicycles. We deployed our first fleet in April of 2023. Now, if you fast forward to now, almost 3 years later, we've learned a lot. Like we made a lot of mistakes. I mean, that first fleet of bicycles did not have the technology that I'm talking about. So we were challenged with with all the problems that come when you're not able to remotely manage your vehicle, right? Theft, having to spend a lot of resources getting those bikes back, poor data to analyze your productivity, not being able to really track the impact and understand whether or not you are actually solving the problem. And then really, gave us insights into what was really needed, right? And so every single deployment since then has improved. Every vehicle version of the vehicle that we put on the road, we just recently, we're now deploying our second version of the motorcycle, and we're on the third version of the cargo bicycle. And we have all of the technology that I talked about, the telemetry, the trackers, the IoT connecting the battery and the vehicle. And we also have a platform that allows us to onboard vendors and connect them directly so that they can actually also monitor what's happening with their goods. And we find that it's an ongoing learning process, right? Like, I don't think that we have perfected it, but I think we've now understood some of the things that are just non-negotiable about being able to manage a fleet with the with the with the goal to actually improve the way that logistics are done on the continent, right?
I know firsthand that the terrain is very, very difficult. And as we are talking, what was going through my mind is, did you do all this yourself, or do you have partners that kind of take some part of the value chain? Because for a company to do all this, in as much as it's very, very good for the business, but that can be quite capital intensive.
Depends on which part you feel, is cost intensive. The bikes, for sure, CapEx is heavy. Right? And so when we started in an environment where you don't have any other choice but to be an OEM. Like in 2023, 2022, it's not like, in the US or in Switzerland or Germany or whatever, supplier, and then just get bikes from them and then choose to focus on rider management and fleet management. And so we had to basically work on the bikes. We had financing partners, right? Funding partners, because we needed money to purchase the assets. We chose very early to be an assembler, not necessarily for fiscal incentive reasons, which is common in most countries, but not necessarily an advantage. It wasn't an advantage in those days in Kenya. But most importantly, because that brought the know-how, the technical know-how that we needed. Like when you assemble and disassemble a vehicle, you also know how to fix it. And we knew very early that bringing e-mobility to the continent we didn't want it to be like, what happened in the time of, solar, or what happens with a lot of other complex machinery on the continent where, it breaks down and then you basically just have to buy another piece in China, or, or you just leave it there to fill up the landfills, right? So for us, it was very important to build that technical know-how very early on. And so we needed funding partners. So we got early funding for that, catalytic funding to enable us to test. So in that way, we have partners, but I think you're referring more to maybe the partnership for the technology.
Right, right. The whole value chain. It's like, so you're doing everything. So I'm curious if you are doing all this yourself, because it's just quite a lot. So from the things you described, I just want to understand, probably also for those listening, if all this is in-house, or do you also have some partners that contribute to the value chain?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the vehicles themselves, we're not a manufacturer. Like, I mean, no one technically, there's no real manufacturer of a vehicle. Like, you have motor manufacturers, you have controller manufacturers, you have battery packers, you have, battery cell manufacturers, you have, the frame manufacturer in China as well. So we work with supply chain partners to design and develop the type of vehicle that we want, including the technology, right? So it's not someone at eWAKA that is actually building the motor. I don't think this happens at any of the other players in the market. But certainly on that front, we have supplier and software partners who design what we want, feed them back the feedback from the drivers. Everything that we've done has been done in partnership with our riders, right? Like really understanding, do you like this piece? The other bike have this? Is this something that you like? Would you like to see it differently and everything? And so when you look at the most recent motorcycle, it's amazing because it really combines all of the things that our writers have told us over the last year and a half. And we've got this, there's still some things that could be improved. So it's a process, right? It's a journey. When it comes to the operational piece there too, right? Like when I say we build our rider onboarding and management platform and our fleet management platform, it wasn't, I'm not a software engineer, right? Like we worked with software development company, and we also explained, we knew that it wasn't something we could get off the shelf, and we really wanted to build something that works for our reality, right? We wanted something that we had spent a year and a half collecting data and understanding of what mattered and what was really key and non-negotiable when it came to onboarding writers. And so we told them, this is what we want, these are the questions we want to ask, these are the things that they must answer, this is good to have, and this is how we want it to flow. And then we built up, the only thing we built in-house was really our database, the data proprietary, and all the pipelines so that we could create the dashboards that we need, and so we could really manage the insights that we get from the data.
This is what something also I came across during my research, that your company put really thought into the process, especially making the vehicles fitable to the African ecosystem, because it is quite different compared to other terrain in the world. But speaking of that, how do you make an e-mobility company like yours bankable in a volatile market? I know the market has a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of potential, but it is also quite volatile.
You run a company like ours is, are you profitable, right? Are you making money? Stability is something that eludes you because, you're building, especially in Africa, you're building in a fragmented space, but you're also building in a very geographically diverse environment. And so, we very focused from the very beginning. We were very focused on our unit economics. We knew that it was important to get it right from the get-go. We would not, be able to rely on grants and other non-dilutive type of funding, so we didn't have that from the get-go. In fact, our first investment was actually a loan. So we knew that we would have to pay back, and so we were very focused on how do you make money. Looking back, I don't know if it was intentional, but it was certainly on our mind that performance architecture was going to have to be number one priority. So we started with being sure that you don't lose your asset. Your main asset is the vehicle. So asset visibility, making sure that you have a tracker and IoT that allows you to securitize, like to keep the asset safe. So we integrated every vehicle in our IoT and fleet management platform. So we have an eye on that. And then we also build the manpower operations to support this, right? This may not be an issue, for example, in the United States or in Switzerland, certainly not an issue, but here this is key. You don't want to lose that main asset. So that's number one. Number two, it's really about what I call discipline. We needed to train the riders. We really needed to know our riders. We needed them to come in. We have built now actually a physical space. We call our training academy, and we have this place where people come. And I know my drivers. I know their names. I know, like in some cases, I have all information on their families, what they do. Are they a student? Is this like their main activity, etc.? So we get to know the people. But that's not all, right? Also building modules on road safety, because again, asset is key. Building modules on digital literacy, because we really want to make sure that, it's not just about us. If the drivers make money, then they want to stay. Like if they don't, they'll leave the bike. I can tell you that. I think key is remittance compliance. So if you don't have a system to make sure that you are paid, that can be very quickly a problem. And on the flip side of that, again, I talk about the asset. In order for you to be able to make money, the asset has to be on the road. So technical ability. We built very early in our model the maintenance and repair pillar. And today we have a curriculum, we have partnership with technical colleges where we're training people on not only assembly, but really maintenance and repair, because this asset has to last you a long time. So we take into consideration the promised longevity, and then we know our terrain, and we know that if the asset doesn't get stolen, you don't want it to be broken down. And so we work very hard on preventive diagnostics and preventive maintenance, but also ability to fix things. We don't want to run to China every time that we have a problem. So that is actually our largest team. And then last but not least, the vendor side of things. Like you need to have a source of deliveries. And we care about that because we don't just want to sell you a bike and then say go fend for yourself and then pay us at the end of the day. That's not what we want. We want to make sure that we understand your performance and we can help you actually increase your earnings. And so that's the second pillar. And then the last pillar, which is really important, is the risk separation. We don't take everything in one bucket. So we sell most of our bikes, like the bigger part of our portfolio is financed by financing partners. So it's off balance sheet for us, and that's really important. But it's also important for us to maintain certain bikes on our balance sheet because we're a fleet manager. So if a driver comes and then doesn't have enough money for a deposit, or doesn't have enough, money to actually, we're not sure that they are not sure that they can actually perform and earn enough to be able to pay a daily fee, we put them on our fleet. They can ride with our vehicles. And then during that time, we train them. They can earn something and they get very good. And we find that a couple of weeks spent on our fleet actually allows them to raise that deposit so that they can actually start to earn enough money to be able to own the vehicle. So we split that risk. And so credit risk actually sits with the capital providers, right? So because of our platform and our system, there is some mitigation because they know that we work very hard. I mean, you can't force someone to stay with you. There is a requirement to stay for a minimum. So we very pleased to see that Our drivers want to stay with us. They actually don't want to go out there and fend for themselves, because when you finish your day with us, you can still do certain things on the side and still earn more money because it is your bike. So operational performance sits with us, and credit risk sits with our capital providers. So that way, the asset becomes an investable asset where you can actually see very clearly where the cash flows are coming from and how they can be enforced. And I like to say that for us, it's really the productivity of the asset. We convert this vehicle into a monitored revenue generating node, right? Like where you can see money came from the sale of the asset, money came from the fleet management, money came from the maintenance is free at eWAKA, but repairs and selling parts is some another source of revenue. And again, you have deliveries as another source of revenue. So these multiple revenue streams allow you to actually have very comfortable gross margins, right? So once you figure that out, I think that the big difficulty for us has been to figure out this very complex. It seems complex, but it's actually everything holds together. So once you put those rails down, then scale is inevitable, because now you can just put everything on top of it, and then it just kind of like follows those.
You absorbed risks, and you have also priced risks into the partnership. Listening to you, I understood that there has been a lot of thinking that has flowed into your business model. Do you think your background in financial industry played a very big role in this?
I am a lawyer. I'm a trained lawyer, and I worked as a transactional lawyer for over 20 years. And yes, I think analyzing and structuring complexity is something that, I was trained to do, and it has definitely helped. But as I was talking about this today with someone actually who works with me, there's so much more to working in Africa. Like, it's one thing to like identify and analyze, structure, mitigate risk, in Switzerland, right, and in capital markets. But when you're working in an operational setting like we are, it's very operationally intense. I think the biggest surprise was how hard that really is, right? Like being here, like I say, we talk to our drivers. Like I talk to the riders. I don't speak Swahili, so I rely on they
Translator. Okay.
well, no, I mean, in Kenya, especially, people speak English pretty well, and so, but
Okay.
we talk, and I had to really immerse myself to be able to communicate, because sometimes things get lost in translation. And being there every day, like being able to see, this is where you have a leakage, this is where you need to tighten, and so I also rely on a very, very good team. I have an excellent fleet management team that understand the intricacies and of and practices. Like I like to say, it's been such a rediscovery of the continent coming back, right? Like I was raised in Cameroon, but I realized that even in Cameroon you can see this. Like every city, every ethnic group, every customs, every like part of the country has different ways of behaving, and you need to really like understand that and understand how to deploy in that environment. So we started in Nairobi. When we went to Mombasa, I mean, it was tough because Mombasa is very different to Nairobi, right? Like when we went to other parts of the country, in the Western region, for example, very different, from an economy point of view, but different from a cultural practice point of view, different from some people are more industrious than others. Some people are using bicycles in some parts of the country, like people didn't want to ride bicycles, right? Like women didn't want to ride bicycles. For men, it was like the poor man's vehicle. I don't want a bicycle. Until they sat on these like amazing e-bikes that we have, and we were like, oh wow, this who needs a motorbike? Like making people understand why this is actually a very good entry point, because you don't need a driver's license, because it's a lot less daunting than getting on a motorbike in these very hectic cities. And so coming here and living here and traveling and being on the front lines has also shown me that my background, my education, my training would not have been sufficient, right? You really need to have a very humble approach to this, right? Like you have to be willing to accept that you need to be taught. So that has been my experience, and I love it. Like I told you when we were preparing for this, I told you, I've never looked back. A lot of people say to me, what do you mean you left Switzerland? And I'm like, yeah, actually, I have never looked back because I think I have grown in ways that I could not have grown, built environment where I was. And you realize that it's not just about, the theoretical knowledge and know-how that you have. It's also about your ability to be able to translate that into an impact, right? Like to be able to build this, right? So yeah, it's not been easy.
This I can confirm, and also based on the feedbacks I have received from diasporas who are also built in Africa. I personally, I can attest to that in some ways, that being on ground is very, very important. And, trying to adapt to the culture, to the people, different culture, different ethnic groups, different mentality, that has been very, very decisive. Also kind of confirms my belief that if you want to run this kind of company that you're doing right now, it is practically impossible. Okay, let me leave the word practically impossible. It will be difficult to run something like this if you are if you are staying in Switzerland. You need to be on ground to run this, right? I have some colleagues who are trying to establish software companies or what have you, and their point is they want to run it completely from Europe. And most times I try to say it's very, very important to be on the ground. And looking at your own case, I feel like you have a lot of software involved into the ecosystem. And based off what you have explained, of course, there's part of hardware involved in it, a lot of hardware. But from your experience, do you think, looking back at what you have done so far, do you think it would have been a success if you have run the company from Switzerland and probably visit the branches in Africa once in a while?
And I think it's really important to understand the space in which you are deploying. Because like I said before, we are very rider-centric, right? We are human-centric operation. You need to understand in what environment you are deploying your vehicles, right? That asset is your key asset. So I always knew that it would not be an option for me, to do this remotely from anywhere. Now that being said, we build teams, so my presence is not required everywhere at all times. We need to build, and this is another, beautiful discovery of, working on the continent. I work with a lot of young, talented people who are also like with the riders who are, yearning for structure and for opportunities to deploy this like enormous talent that they have, right? So, I'm not doing this alone. I have a wonderful team. I've got my co-founder, I've got my my team leads everywhere. So I don't feel that my presence is like the determining factor. I feel that doing it together is what makes the difference. I'm not an investor throwing money at the problem. We're here like co-creating and building this together. When we make mistakes, we own the mistake together and then we fix it, right? And maybe also another thing that is nice about being on the continent is also the very vibrant ecosystem of startups, right? So I'm not the only one. There's a lot of like people from the diaspora like me, and there's a lot of people who did not live outside of Africa, but have grown and built beautiful businesses here, and being able to share is also part of this growth that I'm talking about. So yeah, I don't feel like it is me alone doing it.
Without a team, it's difficult to do. You talked about, I don't know if this is true, so please feel free to correct me, but your aim for 2030 is to have 100,000 bikes. And what must be true for this to be happen. You think at this point it will be self-sustaining rather than capital dependent if you are able to achieve these 100,000 bikes by 2030?
Yeah, so I think to be able to scale, a few things have to happen in parallel. One, we very much focused on vendors and merchants and people generating demand, right? So the demand density per vehicle must remain very strong. And this is like inevitable because when you see just the numbers of people, right now we have 1.4 billion people living on the continent, and half of those are living in cities, right? Like we have very dense cities, even in villages. So being able to deploy in a smart way where you're like really taking advantage of the demand density can generate revenues that can be reinvested. So being able to actually figure that out, like how to take advantage of that demand density. Human capability must scale through structured rider and technician training. We need to be able to like design something that will scale on its own. Like you live in Germany, I live in Switzerland. We have seen the amazing success of the vocational training programs. We aspire to build something like that. And so being able to actually scale that human capability where you have very like savvy drivers and very savvy technicians, effective ones, that also must happen because it's not just about the asset, again, it's about that. And then last but not least, the data platform. Our data platform, the insights we're getting from the data platform, this is really key, like because you won't be able to like grow your staff in numbers. You have to be able to manage this with AI and new, forms of predictive and prescriptive data analytics. You can actually extract a lot of value from human capability. And then also our platform is vehicle agnostic. So right now we're really, quite intentional about our own, vehicles, but this doesn't have to be the case forever, right? Like we're building this platform and we just, we'll be able to put it on, other vehicles. And so I think that scale does not have to come from own capital, right? And so I truly believe that, 100,000 is a low number, right? Like if we get this right this year, we can do multiples of that.
So you can crush that number by 2030. You think it's realistic? Like it's something you can based on all the things you have said so far.
Yeah, I think so. I think we have figured out the model. Now we just need to execute and we need to bring in the right people.
Okay. There is something going on right now in Africa, which is, depend on the way you look at it, it's good and it's bad. But I don't want to go into the political aspect. But there is this local content bill that targets 60% local sourcing. Yet the value chain remains import dependent for the whole of Africa, mostly in terms of this you import from China and what have you. What structural gaps must be solved before that becomes economically viable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You're gonna get me in trouble.
Well, we are trying to push the continent forward. So, that's why I say I have to. We're not being political. We're trying to see how to make sure that at the end of the day, business survive and also the continent get what it wants. But it has to be viable. So, it's just your opinions. Feel free.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about localization, and we've seen like really good results. Places like Morocco, Tunisia, even Kenya has a very vibrant manufacturing ecosystem. But when it comes to e-mobility, even though I acknowledge, and it is a fact that the resources needed to actually create the batteries, for example, come from the continent. In order to be able to produce the finished product, you need an industrial ecosystem. So you can't just start at the most complex end of the chain. Localization requires, first of all, volume. It requires technical capabilities, and then requires data informed forecasting and ability to, to build manufacturing platforms. The first time that I went to a frame factory in China, a bicycle frame factory, and also I also visited the chassis of the bike factory. This is done like by one stakeholder in the value chain. You see that it didn't happen in a vacuum. You need to be able to be producing bolts, to be producing wrenches, tools, keys, etc. We can't just say we're going to go straight to the chassis and then we're going to import all these other tools. So I feel like local assembly is the first step. And I told you when we started, it wasn't necessarily a requirement, fiscal advantage for it, but for us, it was really clear that local assembly already builds that technical capability. Then it's going to be a question after that of selecting which part of the components can you do. And maybe you wouldn't even start with the components. Maybe you would start with, like I said, some of the tools that are needed for it, right? Like India's done it before, right? Thailand, Vietnam, all these, Southeast Asian countries like have taken on certain parts of the value of the supply chain, from China, and it's a process. Then the other thing that I think people forget is China wasn't always the manufacturer of the world. Like I remember when I was in college, I went to college in Ohio, and I had classes from Michigan next door who had been, who'd grown up while during the time where Michigan was at the on the front lines of automotive development. And then when I was in college, this was no longer the case. And that's when some of these auto manufacturers went to China. And then China, through collaboration with them, learned how to be, part of the process, and then eventually took over. So I think partnerships with OEMs, whether they are, Vietnamese, Thai, Chinese, Indian, whatever it is also part of that process. So I feel that there's a way to go. I'm not advocating that we have to do it the way that these countries did, because Africa has a way of leapfrogging, but we'll figure out the part where we can actually say this we can do differently, and it takes time, and that time will come very soon, because through the technical training that we're doing, people will be able to just say, I can do this, like we do. Like we have welders that do incredibly nice battery boxes, for example, already now. 3 years ago we couldn't do this. We need to be able to also build the machinery for it, right? Not just we say we're making boxes and then we'll buy all of the machinery from elsewhere. So it's a matter of time. It will come.
Right, right. I think also that politicians in Africa just have to try as much as they can to resist the populist opinion. Just like you said, in as much as the continent needs to produce its own goods, but I think the decisions needs to be very, very informed. They need to collect data to make sure that at the end of the day, that companies are also able to operate. I also say, in as much as it sounds good hearing, at the end of the day, it is the end user that will suffer. It gets very, very difficult to import and what have you. So it is still the citizens that will suffer, but we don't need to get to that end before they realize the mistakes. So that is just sometimes it marvels me. But I think, like I've said, I don't want the podcast to be political, but it is very important that diasporas and those who are also involved in value chain, can speak up regarding this topic, because at the end of the day, it affects everyone. Now, just coming back, because I want to be mindful of your time. Just a few questions I think we can write it for today, and I think for our listeners, they have been able to gain a lot. There's this topic about diaspora involvement, and there is a potential that they can also help in a very big way to breach the capital issues, FDI, foreign investment. And my question to this regard is, how will their involvement change the incentive alignment different from the way you have the traditional FDI? Do you think that can play a role?
It does, right? I don't know if Well, let me back up for a second. Today, I think I don't remember the number, but at least I think it's 5 billion US dollars come into the continent through diaspora remittance. I believe it's not more. I don't know the statistics, but that amount is already quite astronomical, right? And so we are seeing, diaspora injecting capital in the continent more than actually foreign direct investments. What needs, I think, to change is, the informal nature of this. I think we need to organize the way that we channel capital. I was in Davos this year, and there was a panel discussion around structuring giving in Nigeria. Actually, you know, a lot of people give, like you give to your church, you give to your mosque, give to your family, and when then you die, and then that's. And so we need to think about generational wealth. We need to think about longevity of some of the things that we do. So I feel that there needs to be organization, design thinking, and structuring around the way we operate. It's not enough to say you have all these billions of dollars that are flowing onto the continent. How are they flowing onto the continent? What is the actual impact of it? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think we do have investors. We have fund managers and investors, Africans, in the diaspora and on the continent, who are building this effort and who understand like the risks that we are facing, and also understand how to meet. And so working with those already very formal institutions is one way that the diaspora can actually channel funds in a smart way. Like I always tell people, you don't have to become an entrepreneur to have an impact in Africa. You can invest in someone else, you can invest through someone else. And so I think the last thing that I want to add, I mean, there's so many facets to this discussion, but transparency really also builds trust, and understanding the risks that you run. But it's the same anywhere. You can start a business in Germany and fail. There's some data about that. I don't know, 3 out of 5 within the first year, or within the first 3 or 4 or 5 years. So I think being afraid of failure is not the right way to get into this, because the risks are high. So working with existing, like we say, we stand on the shoulders of
Giants, huh?
of giants. So we need to learn how to look at what was already done. Before I started eWAKA, I did not, somebody said, I think it was, I read this on LinkedIn from a Nigerian entrepreneur. You first go to the cemetery and see where the corpse is laid, right? Because I'm not the first one to, I'm certainly not the first to have tried, but, I don't think I'm the first one, but I have to understand, like, why did, previous companies fail? This logistics and transportation issue it's a problem that we need to solve. And others
Right.
have tried, and you need to understand, why did they fail? Should I do something different, right? And so learning from, those who went before us is also very important.
Okay, powerful. Talking about FDI, I personally also understand what goes on, just because I've also gotten some requests of investors that want to partake in what I'm doing. But just for some certain reasons, I'm not springing onto that. But what I want to ask or understand from your perspective is, I know that capital shapes governance. And how do you prevent capital dependence from shaping strategic direction at eWAKA?
It's a good question. As I mentioned earlier, when we started with a loan, right? Albeit the concession loan from the Swiss government through the Ministry of Economy, the SECO. That forced us into discipline from the very beginning, because we knew, I knew I had to pay that back. So I was very intentional about how we use the money, and making sure that unit economics were positive from the get-go. to ensure that we would be able to pay back. Financial discipline is important because a lot can happen, and a lot can happen in Africa that you just could not even have imagined. Right? Like building that risk map very early felt like, oh, I got all the risks down until something happened that I could not even have possibly imagined. So being prepared for that is also, I think, wise because otherwise you'll freak out. Um, Focus very much on revenue generation, building partnerships. We don't depend necessarily on, the next raise. Of course, you're gonna need to raise money. Like investments is part of this landscape, and so finding the right partner is important. But I think you asked, how that shapes governance.
Right, exactly. Without you losing your, the vision for the company. eWAKA, I assume you have vision for the company, and sometimes nothing against the investors, but sometimes the way they drive founders just to make sure that you provide a lot of return as much as possible can also lead to change in direction and probably poor execution. It just looks everywhere, from the big companies we know today, Apple, Tesla, all these stories have happened. And in Africa right now, a lot of the founders want to get, fund, which is good. But at the end of the day, I believe that you are solving a very critical problem. But if you are not allowed as a founder to do what you want to do, it could become difficult. And that is the reason why I'm trying to gain from your perspective. How do you, in your own case, ensure that this does not prevent you from the direction you have aimed for eWAKA?
I think you have to choose your partners very carefully. An investor, as you say, can really force you into the wrong direction, partly because they don't understand, the constraints that you're facing and, they're coming from a completely different perspective or, sometimes also fear. And so we've been very fortunate that, the investors that we've been able to bring on board and the advisors that we have are people who have a good understanding of operations. They themselves have been go deep in operations and understand what it takes, right? And so they support us. So I think it's important to choose well. Not all money is good money, and sometimes you have to turn down money that feels like it's gonna hold you hostage and take you in a different direction.
Okay. Part of this aim of this podcast is also to help founders. So in your case, how did you find these people? Like I've said, I want to be mindful of your time. Maybe after this one question, and then we can call this. And how do you go about looking for these founders? Of course, it's very important to, like you said, to find the ones that fit in. But I also know that a lot of founders, especially those that don't even have access to a diaspora, a network and what have you. So in your own case, my case, is quite a different ballgame just because of how we have been set up. But for those that have not left the continent and still want to build, how do they ensure that they find the right partners that can help uplift their business?
I like to tell my children that in this day and age, you have no excuse to be ignorant, right? Like right? Like there's so much information. We do research. Now that's what I do, right? Like I was not in the startup ecosystem before. I worked for very established companies, and so I had to also go find out a little bit more about this ecosystem. Again, advisors, right? My board of advisors. When I first started was picked very intentionally, right? Like working with people who have a good understanding of the space, who can direct me. People send me, links. Have you seen this? Apply to that. Like every investor that I have on my cap table was actually referred to me. Of course, you go through the application process and then you start the whole due diligence and you start that conversation. And so I feel that you need to talk to people. You need to surround yourself with people who know. You need to share. A lot of people keep their ideas and what they are doing very close to their vest. It's not going to do you any good because no one is going to know to help you because they don't know what you're doing, right? Having conversations like the one that I'm having with you, explaining what you're doing, it's so difficult to just get across what you're doing, especially on this continent on a deck, right? it's so much more complex than that. A lot of people come, they say, "Oh my God, you're doing so much." Well, come here and see how you can do one thing.
Yeah.
So I say to the young people, and people like me, people, whether you are from the diaspora or whether you are just someone, hustling out here, building something, take heart, talk to people, do research. There's a lot of information out there. Find a partner, stick with the partner, know when a relationship needs to be ended and know when you need to move on. But, try not to burn bridges because, it's a small world.
Very, very interesting. Celeste, if your work succeeds, what dependency should the next generation no longer have?
If what we're doing works, we will no longer be dependent on the poor infrastructure that we've inherited from the past. People will be able to move in a way that actually reflects the way that we live and the way that and the needs that we have. It's not the case today, but we're building that rail to be able to onboard all sorts of vehicles. It's not just about the e-bikes and the e-motorcycles. There will be three-wheelers, there will be trucks, there will be cars, there will be, the right vehicles for the infrastructure that we have. And one of the things, you saw during the time that we were talking, there were two blackouts, and some people have said to me, well, you have this problem, which is a bigger problem. How can you have e-mobility when you haven't solved the access to energy problem? And I agree, that is a problem that we need to solve. But I don't think that it will be solved the way that, for example, Switzerland solved it, right? I think that we're going to need to also think, and we're doing this, we work with partners who think in terms of distributed, energy systems. And all of that is, comes together. We use these batteries for e-mobility and, like second life use can you have from the batteries. These are things that we're going to need to reflect on, we're going to need to think about. I think that it's, we talked about this also earlier. I don't think it's one, it's those things are mutually exclusive. Our countries, Cameroon, Nigeria, we have, huge resources and gas. And so, one does not exclude the other. I think we're going to have to find, the right combination of power production, power distribution, how do we maintain transformers, upgrade systems better in some cases and not in others, etc. India has done it. I think we can do it too.
I think that's a great place to end this episode. I think we too can do it. Thank you very much, Celeste. It has been a pleasure talking to you, and I've been able to gain more insight about what needs to happen in Africa and what we must do to make sure that we keep building. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tobe. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We on the wave, Lagos to the world. We build, we brave, we build, we brave, we build, we brave, we brave, we build.
Continent DNA.